this point, now, what do you think and particularly the United States could do for the Ukrainian crisis, being really realistic?
Yeah, well, I think the West and the United States can be supportive of Ukraine in a couple of ways. One is to be helpful in terms of trying to work with Ukraine in terms of economic reform, for example, and being supportive with the International Monetary Fund, which I think the West has done. But the second part, I think, is being responsive in terms of what seems to me has now become a fairly obvious conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And so I do think it's a positive step that both Washington and the European Union are applying additional economic sanctions on Russia. And I think that the United States should look at things like the Ukrainian request to sell arms. We're now talking about Ukraine's ability to defend itself against an outside invasion, and I think the United States has an interest in helping Ukraine to defend itself.
Like a lot is told about non-military option, the importance of it, but how important is a military option and what exactly?
Ultimately, at the end of the day, if Ukraine wants normalcy, there has to be a solution that the Russians will accept, because the Russians have the ability, using economic means, energy means, military means, to cause disruption in Ukraine. The problem is, and I think obviously a diplomatic solution is preferred, but at the end of the day, I'm not sure the Russians are prepared to accept that. I mean, certainly you could have seen a negotiation 3 months ago, but the Russians were not prepared to use their influence with the separatists in the east to get them to stop fighting. And in fact, the Russians increased the flow of weapons to there. And ultimately in August, we saw Russian troops coming into Ukraine. So a lot of this question depends on, are the Russians prepared to deal?
But at the same time, a lot of people would tell that, Ukraine in fact have weapon. The way it's how it's used and the way how this is, control and command system is working. So what do you think, even if the Ukraine will get the opportunity to buy the weaponry, what should it mean, to what will it lead, and how helpful it could be?
Well, that's a question for Ukraine. I mean, one of the questions in Washington when some of us suggest it's time to provide arms to the Ukrainian military. The question is, well, what do we do then when the Russians escalate? That's a question I think Ukrainians have to ask. And my argument would be, if Ukrainians are prepared to take that risk, then I think the United States should be helping Ukraine to defend itself.
When we talk about the arms, what kind of arms are we talking?
I mean, the first question is, what does the Ukrainian military need? But I've heard things like anti-tank weapons, things that would allow the Ukrainian military to deal better with armor on the other side. Perhaps some light surface-to-air missiles. But again, the Ukrainian military will know what it needs. And I think the United States there's more that we could do in terms of non-lethal assistance, in terms of helping the Ukrainian military reorganize itself. But I do think it's time for
So far, there was some amounts of money were named that they would become as an assistant to Ukraine. But what exactly is that? Because there are so many figures jumping all the time. Yeah. It's very, very much confusing for the Ukrainians.
Right now, I think in terms of military assistance, the United States is now providing $60 to $70 million worth of assistance, and it's flowing relatively slowly. I would like to see that number increased, and I would like to see the aid come to Ukraine more quickly than it has.
There are quite a few. So
after the after the NATO summit in Wales, if to summarize, what actually had changed?
Well, I think the NATO summit was focused basically on bolstering how NATO would deal with what most NATO members now see as a Russian threat that was not there a year ago. So you've seen NATO agree on doing.
So what would be the real results of NATO summit? Are they really prepared? Have they more prepared and more flexible to current nowadays challenges?
Well, I think there's a recognition now by most, if not all, NATO members that there is a concern about Russia. There's a security concern that wasn't there a year ago. And it's a combination of the Russian buildup in its military capabilities, but also the readiness to use them both in Crimea and now in eastern Ukraine. So what the NATO focus was on was, how does the alliance basically build up its capabilities in the Baltic states in Central Europe to make very clear that there would be a military defense for that. So that was really the focus of the NATO summit. Now there was also, I think, an extension of political support for President Poroshenko, and that was a very important conversation. But in terms of doing things like providing military assistance, I think that's pretty clear that will not be a NATO decision, that will be left up to individual countries.
You know, this status of the Ukraine-US ally, what is that? On what stage we are, and what does it mean?
Yeah, well, the United States has a number of countries which it has non-NATO military alliances. It's a status. It's under discussion. I'm actually not sure how far and how fast it's going to go. It hasn't been a question that I've seen a lot of focus on in Washington. Certainly, when you talk to people in Congress, the more focus there is what can you do in real terms to help Ukraine. And my guess is if the American administration decided it was prepared to supply more military assistance, I think there would be fairly quick support in Congress for that.
Being pragmatic, having all the troubles with ISIS in Syria and Iraq, to how much attention would be still alive and towards the Ukraine?
Well, for those of us who spend their time thinking more about Ukraine than ISIS, I mean, this is one of the real issues that you have to deal with in Washington, is when you get to the senior level, at the president, you only have so many hours in a day, and right now the foreign policy focuses on how do you deal with ISIS, Iraq, and Syria, and that's taken away attention that could have been devoted to Ukraine. So, I wish it were otherwise, but that's simply a practical, the way it works.
But how to explain? Because there would be always people dragging to some extremes that, like the US is just caring about ISIS or like...
No, I wouldn't. I mean, there's a lot of people who are thinking about Ukraine, and I think you'll see some of that when President Poroshenko visits Washington next week. Now, the question, I think, will be is, does that become a meeting that begins to take American support to Ukraine to a different level? And at this point, we'll just have to see.
And we talk the energy is extremely important, especially energy dependency of Ukraine now, before the winter, and also the European dependency. So how realistic and are all this discussion about the U.S. involvement in the building the energy, in not having the Europe so much dependent on Russian oil and gas and helping Ukraine with that?
Yeah, I wish there was more the U.S. could do in that regard, but right now, in about 2 years, the first American plant to export liquefied natural gas comes online, and that'll export about 20 billion cubic meters of gas per year. By 2020, we could be exporting about 100 billion cubic meters of gas a year. The problem is, when American companies export gas, they're going to look at the price in Europe, and they're going to look at the price in Asia. The prices in Asia are much higher, so that gas is likely to go to Asia. Now, the beneficial impact for Europe is that may free up some Middle East gas to come to Europe. But my sense is that while the Americans have an ability to put more gas onto global markets, I'm not sure it's going to have a very quick or a very immediate effect on Europe. I mean, for Ukraine, it seems to me, and this is one of the things that, again, with the conflict in eastern Ukraine, it's taken some attention away, but there still is in Ukraine, as there's been for 20 years, the possibility to significantly increase Ukraine's production of gas. And you've got American companies, you've got Chevron, which is in western Ukraine, you have Shell, which is in eastern Ukraine. Now, Shell's in a difficult situation because of the conflict there, but, working with Chevron to promote unconventional gas there would be a big part of the answer for Ukraine.
There is constant discussion about a new round of sanction, especially by Europe. And so it's got also confusing. What else could be still the method to put some pressure on Russia?
Well, I think you're seeing additional economic sanctions. The Europeans have now targeted a number of institutions connected with the Russian oil industry. There will be later on today additional sanctions announced in Washington. I think those sanctions are having a big impact on the Russian economy and are going to be very disruptive. What they so far have failed, though, is they haven't yet gotten Vladimir Putin to make a significant change in his political course. And that's why I think more robust sanctions are in order.
A lot of Ukrainian military on the ground told me that, the thing which would be extremely helpful rather than lethal weapon is access to the online maps, which the US can have. Why it's not there? Would you have an explanation, because they can't ask this from their generals.
I don't know that answer on that question.
But do you think it would be some, because there is always the discussion that US can help with intelligence, but we don't really get it, like, is this help there?
Yeah, well, one of the issues that we've had historically with Ukraine is that the question always is, if you're sharing intelligence with Ukraine, who else are you sharing it with? And that's always been sort of an issue. But as regards the specific question about the specific request for intelligence, I'm just not sure.
And finally, how do you think, there was a recent report by Brookings Institute, especially about the danger of Ms. Mogherini as a head of the, like, not a danger, that she's not the right choice at this point, having been not sympathetic, but pretty sympathetic as the Italians to Moscow. What do you think? I mean, but she's appointed. What do you think would be the role of this European Commission at this thing?
Well, first point about Ms. Mogherini. I mean, as the High Representative for Common and Foreign Security Policy, that's an important position. But I think it's also very clear when you look at the European Union that individual countries, Germany, Poland, France, Britain, those countries are the main countries that are shaping EU policy towards Russia. So I think her appointment comes out of this very interesting and sometimes strange bureaucratic moving within the European Union. Her choice was based as much on intra-EU issues as it was on her foreign policy expertise. But even last week, when you looked at the comment she made about Russia, I think she's already moving towards the EU line and adopted a much tougher line on Russia.
And the last one, like many people tell that, the main is to reform the country, and for a lot of people saying, like, if there would be financial support with Ukraine, it's important that this money are used. What are real mechanisms? And what could be the real oversight from outside? We understand how it's working from inside with a lot of civil society and all the things. But what are, like, a real thing we as the Ukrainians can follow, that those money are not wasted, and what could be also international partners doing regarding that?
Yeah, well, that's always very hard to check that. I think the International Monetary Fund has in place checks to make sure its money goes to the right place. Ultimately, to my mind, the biggest indicator of whether Ukraine has it right will be the measures of private capital flows into the country. And the question will be, to the extent that Ukraine gets the right business environment and money's not going to corruption, then you're going to see the private money coming, which is going to be much more than the IMF.
And we talk about IMF. IMF is always, in all the cases, very critical that this money is not like just should be spent, that they would put into place, that they would reform. And but now we have a critical situation when a lot of infrastructure is destroyed, it's targeted, and there is a crisis. So how to deal in this situation when you really, if you have a schools broken and the bridges exploded, so how you can talk that you just need money to rebuild them.
Well, that's going to be a question. What can Ukraine pull together, and what can the West offer in terms of money apart from the IMF program that's designed to sort of help Ukraine recover infrastructure, as opposed to the IMF money, which is really focused at promoting economic reforms.
So on which stage are these discussions? Do you know something about
I don't know on those. I mean, the Germans, I think, have offered some reconstruction assistance for Donbass. My guess is others, if it becomes clear that the situation in Donbass is now settled and there's not going to be a resumption of fighting, then you may have other countries contribute as well.
Do you think it's settled?
I don't know. I hope the fighting is settled. I very much hope that we're not seeing the fighting of the last 3 months continue. But it seems to me that the ceasefire has to now be followed by a process aimed at finding a political settlement. And when I look at what President Poroshenko says, which strikes me as a very logical approach, but then I look at what the leaders in Donetsk and Luhansk say, and I look at what the Russians have said, it's not clear to me. It's going to be a very difficult task to pull together a position that gets those three parties to agree. And I'm not sure how optimistic I'm going to be about that.
Thanks. Okay. Thanks so much.